I used to think of us guys in graduate school, which I didn't enjoy in anthropology, of becoming doctors of society. So being able to save society from itself in some way, but what a joke.
That is somewhere what you did by
Yeah.
recording.
Yeah.
You sort of saved some evidence. It is
Yes.
somewhat evidential
Yes.
as to how things were.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe your instinct about, which was always in this ethnographic, you chose very specific kinds of places in all these years. You didn't look at your contemporary man, essentially, the societies around you in a contemporary time. You looked for societies that were sort of caught in their own time.
My wish that there be as little background, as what I used to call background noise as possible, accounted for me going to places where there wasn't all this white noise, of modernity or all this white noise of something else going on, that it was clear in some fashion, or clearer than it would have been had been clashes of cultures and clashes of ideas. And
The authenticity of this kind of experience is so rare today. We're living in multiple layers of imitations culturally, etc., and yet you found these places which were so to themselves separate from the swirling world around them. That's what's so valuable about what, the films still give us a sense of, right? But it was also an incredibly privileged life for you.
Indeed. I mean, here was this woman who was really a well-known figure in Boston during her lifetime, who was also well-known to myself and my siblings, not because we got to know her personally, but because we lived in her house being a summer house that she lived in for a long time before she built the museum to which she moved. She lived in this wonderful old Jamaican planters style house that was called Green Hill. So when I was growing up, of course, her presence was really felt because we all knew that it was her summer lodging, and we all were aware that much of what was there in the way of furniture and furnishings, sort of pictures and other stuff, were things that she didn't think were, I guess, important enough to put in her museum, but were certainly nice in and of themselves. And I grew up, being reminded all the time, wherever I looked and wherever, people talked about the place we were as children living, that there was this famous old lady who, I think it even at one time had a panther as a pet on a leash that she sort of walked around Boston with. I mean, she was considered a rather eccentric woman, but her eccentricities went in directions that were, I think, really quite marvelous. I mean, she had a real correspondence with Dostoevsky. You don't have a real correspondence with Dostoevsky unless you are interested in literature or unless you're interested in ideas. Quite formidable, even, I think, to some extent, derided or laughed at woman for her eccentricities, in whose house I grew up. That's all I have really to remember about her, because I never met her. I mean, she died before I was born. I was just constantly reminded by my surroundings in that house of the fact that this woman had lived there until she built the what's called Fenway Court. I mean, I like that name for the museum better than the Gardner Museum. I think Fenway Court makes more sense. When she put that up, we'd all go in there occasionally and enjoy ourselves as young appreciators of nice things or of great spaces and so forth. I mean, she was a friend of contemporaries of hers in age who were making art. I mean, Sargent and people like that were well known to her as people. Whistler, I think she probably knew also. If Picasso is going to be interested in African art and iconography, then there are other people are going to be too. He led the way. Paris intellectual life was full of people who were interested in the art of that continent and who spent as much time as they could looking at it or even going to see it in situ. There were tons of people interested in the cultures that were so expressive musically and in plastic arts that you couldn't avoid it. You could walk into the Musée de l'Homme in Paris and you're confronted by this array of inventiveness and wondrous art that you're swept away by its depth and imagination. The intellectuals of Paris would have their coffees at the Deux Magots and they'd chat and have a nice time and learn from each other. It was a really nice scene. Jean was part of it. Jane Rouche was part of it. Rouche was somebody who was not really much interested in art, I didn't think. He was interested in ritual.
Au-dessous se trouve la statue du gouverneur, avec ses moustaches, son sabre, son fusil.
And I was always curious about his own work in Africa.
Et la possession commence, lentement, par le pied gauche, puis par le pied droit. Elle monte par les mains, les bras, les épaules et la tête. Et le premier possédé se lève. C'est Capral Gardi, le caporal de garde. Une femme est tombée sur le sol. C'est la Magazia, l'une des reines des prostituées d'Accra. Elle est possédée par un génie femme, Madame Salma. Madame Salma, c'est la femme du lieutenant Salmon, l'un des officiers français qui vint le premier au Niger à la fin du siècle dernier. Madame Salma a reçu la robe et le casque colonial. Elle va faire l'inspection de la nouvelle statue du gouverneur. Puis le lieutenant casse un œuf sur la tête du gouverneur. Pourquoi un œuf? Pour imiter le plumet que les gouverneurs britanniques portent sur leur casque. Car le voilà, le véritable gouverneur. Au Trooping de Colors de l'ouverture de l'Assemblée à Accra. Canonton, et dans cette foule, il y a des Aoukas qui sont venus ici pour chercher leur modèle. Et si l'ordre est différent ici et là, le protocole est bien le même.
I felt that some of the things he did were really quite amazing.
Le général, dans le civil, est simple soldat. Et par un hasard extraordinaire, c'est devant le Mental Hospital, devant l'hôpital psychiatrique d'Accra, que nous trouverons l'état-major. Le gouverneur, le conducteur de locomotive, le conducteur de camion. Ils sont employés aux waterworks, aux travaux d'adduction d'eau de la ville. Et en voyant ces visages souriants, en apprenant que ces hommes sont peut-être les meilleurs ouvriers de l'équipe des waterworks, en comparant ces visages avec ces visages horribles de la veille, on ne peut s'empêcher de se demander si ces hommes d'Afrique ne connaissent pas certains remèdes qui leur permettent de ne pas être des anormaux, mais d'être parfaitement intégrés à leur milieu. Des remèdes que nous ne connaissons pas encore.
I met Jean Rouge, I think it was a UNESCO conference that I was invited to and he was invited to, and we sort of fetched up together there. And I think, as a matter of fact, that the Hunters, which I had something to do with shaping, was the subject of our mutual regard in a way, and he You know, he was interested in the film as a film.
The northern Kalahari is a hard, dry land. In this bitter land live a quiet people who call themselves Kong or Juntwasi. Juntwasi could be translated ourselves, as opposed to Judole, meaning strangers. Far from generous, the land provides a livelihood only to those who know it well, and the people must travel from time to time throughout the year to where the different wild foods ripen according to their season. During the months of winter, there is no rain except for scattered showers that fall in October. And even in the rainy season, January through March, an unfortunate area may receive no rain from one year to the next.
I can remember really staying up very late at night at the Peabody Museum with a projector and just looking and looking and looking and looking and looking at the footage that this guy had made for many years. He started as a 13-year-old or a 15-year-old or something like that, and he had kept shooting every time he went there, which was every year, I think, right through his college days, which is when I first knew him. My involvement in it was put in my lap, in a way, by the head of the museum, Peabody Museum, which had been sponsoring for years these trips of the marshals out to the Kalahari. And when I came along, they thought it was nice because I had already done films. I'd done London Harbor, I'd done a film called Mark Tobey. I knew about film. So it was not unnatural that we sort of fell into each other's sphere. Joe Brew, who was director of the Peabody Museum back in those days, he said, "That's wonderful, because now you can help John Marshall." I said, "Who's John Marshall?" He said, "Oh, John Marshall is this wonderful kid who's still an undergraduate at Harvard, and he has been shooting film in the Kalahari Desert for the last 5 years. So it's this immense body of work that he's accumulated, which needs help in being sorted out in some fashion." I said, "Okay, well, I'll give it a try." And so I became, in a way, a collaborator of John's. He had already secured some help from a commercial, what we used to call commercial filmmakers, people who made company films, films for, I don't know, a bank or something, who had helped him put together I think like a 40-minute or a 30-minute version of the film that became known as The Hunters. Then I saw the rest of the footage, or I saw a lot of it, a lot more of it, maybe I saw all of it. And I said, "John, there's a much bigger film here." I said, "This isn't really all that can be done with this material that you shot. How about giving a go to making an entirely different kind of film, much longer, much deeper, maybe more narrative even, story that has characters, as The Hunters does. And The Hunters are a number of particular people. At the end of several months, we had a very nude version of The Hunters. John wrote a beautiful commentary for it. He was really a good writer.
Goma the leader. Goma the vigorous and able. He was a man of many words and a lively mind, one who had traveled to the edges of his world. He had a little of the clown in him. On a dry and trying day, he relished a bitter water root. Goma was not descended of headmen. He married into a headmanship that he cannot bequeath, but he was the perfect man for a job which brings no rewards and often earns only worry. It pleased Goma to be headman. With the new baby, Goma had become a family of 5. When he praised himself, he said, "Katlangi," which is to say, "I am the sharpest edge of the arrow."
And it ended up, after our collaboration, being 75 minutes long instead of 45 minutes long, and a very different film, really, I think. I never would for a moment say that I had anything except a peripheral influence on him. I mean, I think I did suggest some things that finally got into the film, and the film became quite different from what the commercial guy was trying to make him do. But then out came the hunters, and this sort of astonished the anthropology world.
Twee returned. He had been eastward, hunting all day in a waterless place. Twee, called crooked because of his disharmonious shape. He was a simple, kindly man and an optimist who tended to remember only the better times of his life. He once shot a guinea fowl through the neck, which was amazing marksmanship and phenomenal luck. He knew a great deal about animals, and since he was able to mimic them with humor and genius, he often did so, and other men found Twee amusing. That day, Twee had seen nothing but a chameleon and a wild pig running far away. Gao also returned. Gao, forthright and humble, and quiet, sometimes with the quiet of great awareness, and sometimes with the silence of mood. He was perhaps the best craftsman in the werft, making arrows with perfect balance and proportion. If sickness or evil befell the people, and they called a dance to fight it, Gao would go into deep, long trance. Then he served his people as a medicine man, with all his heart.
Everyone just got very excited by this film, which for the first time was a very well done visual expression of important anthropology. And it was done with a lot of cinematic interest in it and cinematic originality to it, especially in editing, because, I mean, when you talk, when anyone sees the hunters, they don't realize that it's not the same giraffe in every scene, you know, it's not the same hunters, you know, in all the scenes. It's a confection, cinematic confection, which had a lot of authority and conviction to it. So people were very excited, and they said, oh, well, this is a new day for anthropology. Well, in a way, it was a new day for anthropology, I guess.
A large creature, having an important death, the giraffe left a sudden hollow in the world behind her. The hunters were aware of the hollow and felt it anticipating. Uncertain, now at the loss of day, in the land being abandoned by the sun, the men who did not know what active thing might be coming to replace the giraffe, perhaps to spoil the meat, and yet who knew that so much life could not be gone and unnoticed, let Gao, because he was a medicine man, open the giraffe. He cut into her infected thigh. Gao found that the meat was very good, and it was cut into strips to cook while they worked.
I think the family, his father and mother probably, she was a good ethnographer. She did a lot of technical anthropology on the Bushmen. I think they felt that I was stealing John's thunder or something, and that really I should not be in the mix to the extent that I was. I think John was okay with the fact that I gave him ideas and that we worked together on editing. It was only when the notion of what to do with all the other material that was not a part of the Hunters film, that things got bad. It was then that all the marshals decided that I should not be putting my stamp on this material the way my plan would have resulted in. John was in grad school. He had to quit graduate school and come back, find a place to edit, and he and Tim Ash went off and did it. I went off and had a life of my own. Well, in fact, there's a fairly important document, which is a letter I wrote to the director of the museum or to John, or I CC'd them all or something, which laid out my plans, because I'd been asked to not just consult, but to become involved in the cutting of all this material. I set out a plan to reduce this great corpus of film to a series of distinct individual films that had titles and had themes and so forth, and that I was prepared to start cutting. Well, when the moment that letter reached John, I'm afraid that he said, "Oh, no, you don't," or something, or his father did, or something. It was very much a family matter. This is John's work and so forth. And I agreed, I thought that was just fine. I mean, I said we should make a film called The Gatherers. Well, they're the hunters, who hunt for food, and they're the gatherers who dig for food. The problem immediately arose that it couldn't be me doing it. And so I really bowed out. It really totally freed me up to do something of my own. I didn't have to be a part of this family enterprise any longer. I started my own project, which was in New Guinea, and that ended up in Dead Birds. From a very early age, I invented for myself the idea of a suit that was made of something I called impervium. Impervium was a metal that prevented anything from entering into me. I could not be gotten at because I wore this thing called a suit of impervium. You just ask any psychiatrist what this kid is doing. It's all so simple-minded. It's just pathetic. I didn't want to die. So give me a suit of impervium, please. That lies at the bottom of a lot of what I wanted to think about and eventually did, I guess, was this concern.
No combat will start until each side has their men in position. Excitement is high, but the air is chill, and no battle is worth fighting very long in discomfort.
When I made Dead Birds, I was interested in death. That was what motivated me, or what absorbed me. I was interested in the theme of violence, what is in us that makes us, or seems to make us, prone to hurting others. And I hope that at the end of the film, people could ponder this question enough to say, gee, they take care of their violence, and they seem to be doing a pretty good job of it.
One's soul or seeds are especially sensitive to the death of a friend or member of the family. By contrast, causing the death of an enemy is tonic to the soul and lifts the spirit.
They are not wiping out their supposed enemies. They're not plundering the others that live near them. If they did do all those things, of course, there would be no purpose to the war. I mean, there would be no way to have their ritual activities continue if there wasn't an enemy. That's what I wanted to show, violence under control. And I went in 1961, 50 years ago, almost to the day, and shot film. No one shoots film anymore. What's film? I mean, you can't even get it processed. Because I think I went to New Guinea for the first time in '61, and we were engaged in all kinds of mock and not so mock belligerence with such enemies as Russia and so forth. And I thought, oh, well, maybe I can shed some light on what man's lust for violence really comes to.
The enemy came this morning to kill, to avenge the ghost of their warrior slain by Wayek's group more than 2 weeks before. Until they do, they live in a state of spiritual decline. Both sides believe that each man has a soul.
This was totally like landing on the moon in its utter novelty. And I looked out across this place and I saw these villages and I said, my God, if that's where we're going, let's get going. We're met by a huge crowd of Dani, who had obviously been aware of our presence for a very long time and wondered what we were doing. Were we coming to punish them? Were we coming to be nice to them or anything else? My journals of the time indicate a good deal of concern over whether we were going to be eaten ourselves. But it was a story of their lives. It was an exciting story. It really, really was. And it was nothing that I much made up. It was pretty much what I was observing at the time.
But you created this sort of narrative.
I took a character and fictively went about telling a story. Yeah, I mean, it's very fictive, that film, in that sense of being shaped.
You're sort of inventing a form in some ways that was put into question. I mean, you were.
Yeah.
How do you look back on that?
I look back and thank God that I had the courage to dismiss these criticisms to a large extent of not being more literal or something, being subjective, in the way I approached it, having my own feelings involved in the editing of it.
Heat from the bright sun increases Pua's customary lack of watchfulness. He cares about his pigs, but his young mind wanders just the same.
This little kid slept under my bed at night, and I got to know him pretty well, and I think I knew him well enough to hazard a guess at what his thinking was, what his feelings were. I really didn't want either art or science to overwhelm the other.
Wayak relaxes, waiting for his comrades and the enemy to signal their readiness by drawing close enough to fire.
I mean, I felt as though I had gotten to some kind of a promised land. The sound of the mourning dove was the signal for war, and you could hear it being sung in a way up and down the valley, so that they were informing in this song that was passed village to village where the next fighting would be. And when I heard that, I was thrilled. I think the first time I refused to let anybody go but myself, because I didn't want to interrupt it. I didn't want it to stop.
With so many men firing such a quantity of arrows, there is always a chance that one of the many wounds they are certain to inflict will bring about the death they want so much.
And as I looked around me, I certainly can remember feeling how alien these people seemed without being alien, at least without my thinking they were alien, because they were naked and I was not naked. They wore this incredible gourd, sometimes short, sometimes long, on their penis. And I didn't wear one of those things. I never tried to become them. But I remember thinking that if I can allow people to regard these people who are so seemingly alien, then I will have shown somehow the unity of mankind. I mean, that's good. You can get beyond all these stumbling blocks, then you're right into the heart of the matter.
Each life that's taken is celebrated by both sides. The ones that lose a life prepare a chair, the only furniture they know, to lift the corpse for ghosts to see while they cry and have their funeral.
Norman Mailer once said the most terrible thing that anyone can do is to kill another man. That's the ultimate inhumanity, if you will. I concluded that there was some need for an expression of violence in men, in these men and probably other men. It's horrible, but I think it may be true.
Though in a weird way, you're saying that at least there were rules of that warfare.
And that was what made me so incredibly pleased with what I saw.
Until they do,
and
a state of spiritual
contemptuous of what I experienced, because I don't think there are any bounds to our determination to use violence. Maybe the atom bomb is its own deterrent, but boy, it doesn't seem to me there are many others.
A wounded enemy is carried home on the shoulders of his friends. Nilik, not yet convinced the enemy was content to end the fighting, keeps a watchful eye, as do two young warriors who, a moment before, sought in vain to kill each other. At the end of the ridge, the others hurl abusive jokes instead of spears. The enemy, for now, is forced to listen.
I had no compunctions about doing what I was doing, which was admittedly hoping that they would not give up their ritual wars. I wasn't asking them to do anything, much less asking them to do something like go to war with each other. I knew this to be part of their natures, or part of their cultures at least, and that I wanted them to not stop being themselves.